In today's episode, I'll show you how to make these elegant but simple bookcases. I made these two bookcases out of 3 sheets of plywood and a few sheets of beadboard. My method for breaking down the plywood is pretty simple. I put a sheet of 1/2-inch foam insulation down on the ground, and then I lay the plywood on top. The foam will protect the face of the plywood, and it also gives me a nice soft surface to cut into with my track saw. The first pieces I cut are the side panels for the case. Since I don't have a longer track for my saw, I cross-cut the waist at the top of the panel. The next panel that I'm breaking down will have the tin shelves, the top, middle, and bottom panels. The way my cut list software organized the pieces, I'm able to break this sheet down into 3 manageable pieces. With all of the pieces cut to rough size, I can put away the foam panel and start to use the table saw to cut them down to their final sizes, and that starts with the cabinet sides. I start by ripping the 4-foot panel in half, and then reset the fence to 11 inches to cut all 4 sides. The final length of the side panels is 7 feet long. This is way too long to cut on my miter gauge, so I'm going to use my track saw. I clean up one end of both panels, and once flush, clamp them together and rotate the boards. I'm going to cut them to their final length at the same time to ensure that they're the same exact length. Since I have 2 sets of the sides for 2 cabinets, I put some tape on both pieces and made marks so that I know which panel goes together. It's really easy to get this stuff mixed up. The final pieces to cut the width are the top, middle, and bottom panels. These pieces are narrower than the side panels, so I set the fence to 10 3/4 of an inch and cut those to width. After knocking out 16 pieces to width for the 2 cases, I need to cut them to length. I bust a crosscut sled out and then set the fence and cut the tin shelves to length. I just released a video on my channel showing how I made a 0 clearance dadoing jig to make this process foolproof. You make a mark from the bottom of the side panel to the bottom of the dado, and then you line the jig up. The jig has a kerf the exact size of the bit, so I know exactly where it's going to cut. And speaking of the bit, I used a 23 30-seconds plywood bit, and that's made specifically for plywood, since we all know plywood's not exactly 3/4 of an inch thick. Next, I mark a line for the middle shelf dado and repeat the same steps. To hold the beadboard panel in, I route a 3/8 inch wide, 1/4 inch deep rabbet on the back edge of the side panels for the back panel using my dado stack at the table saw. And finally, before assembling the case, I need to drill about 1 million shelf pin holes for the adjustable shelves. To begin, I place a shim on the top of the panel, which will make sure that I start the holes in the same location on both sides. One quick warning about drilling the holes: if you are going to put edge banding that's 3/4 of an inch or thicker on your shelves, make sure that you put the holes in far enough from the edge of the panels so that the solid wood edging won't hit them, and please don't ask me how I know this. To glue up the case, it's kind of awkward due to the size, but it's not too bad. With glue in the dados, I place the shelves on one side of the case, and then I lean it over to attach the other side. Since I use the plywood router bit, the grooves are pretty tight. I throw a couple of clamps on the case to pull everything in, and then I shoot a few brad nails in. Now I can attach the top, and I do that by putting 4 pocket hole screws on each end of the panel. I put the cabinet face down on my assembly table and place the panel in position. I use a clamp to prevent the panel from moving, and then I drive in the screws. The face frame of the cabinet was made out of solid lumber. While I typically mill my own lumber, for this project I saved a lot of time by using S3S poplar. It was only 15 cents more a board foot, and since I wasn't footing the bill, it wasn't a concern. The rails and stiles of the frame were 2 inches wide, so I set my table saw fence to 2 inches and batched out the pieces. Next, I used the crosscut sled and a stop block to cut them all to length. For the joinery method, I used my domino, but pocket holes or dowels would work perfectly for a task like this. To cut the joinery, I push the piece up against my bench dogs, line up the center line with the domino, and make the plunge. This process is super quick, and I was able to knock out the entire frame in less than an hour. Before assembling the frame, I cut the curve in the top rail by first taping the template on. I removed the majority of the waste at the bandsaw, and then using a flush trim bit, make an exact clone. The glue up is super simple. I put glue on the dominoes and then put it together like Legos. I throw a few clamps on and wait about an hour before removing them. You'll notice that I glued the frame together on top of the case. It was the only surface in the shop that would support the frame. To attach the face frame, I just put some glue on the edge of the case and then clamped it in place for a few hours. Plenty of glue surface for a task like this. One thing that I did do while making the frame is cut the rails about 1/8 of an inch longer than they needed to be so that the frame would overhang the sides of the case. This gave me a little wiggle room to make sure that the frame was the correct size. And once the glue dried, I came back with a flush trim bit and flushed the sides up. So moving on to the doors, and they're a basic shaker style door with a 1/4 inch MDF panel in the middle. I wanted to keep the design minimal, so I opted out of any sort of molding, and I cut the rails and stiles to length just using a crosscut sled. Next, I mark a center line on the rails and then transfer that line to the stile for the domino. I put a single 6x40mm domino on each corner. And finally, I cut a 1/4 inch MDF panel to size at the table saw. For painted projects like this, I really like using MDF. To glue up the doors, it's pretty much identical to the face frame. I put glue on the dominoes, stick the MDF panel in the groove, and assemble the doors. I throw a couple of clamps on the corners and let it set for a couple of hours. The shelves are 3/4 inch plywood, and to hide the edges and to strengthen them a little bit, I added a 1 1/4 inch strip of wood to the front edge. I rip a bunch of strips at the table saw and then glue them to the plywood shelf. Since I had 10 shelves to work on, I nailed the strips using an 18 gauge brad nail, and that allowed me to remove the clamps and quickly move on to the next shelf. To mount the hinge adapter plates, I strike a line 2 inches down from the bottom side of the middle shelf face frame, and then 2 inches up from the bottom. This is the center line for the plate. I then bring that line to the back side of the face frame to make it easier when lining up the adapter plate. The hinge plates have a little lip on the front edge that seats on the corner of the inside edge. To make the installation a little easier, I drew a center line on the bracket so that I can just line it up with my mark and know that it's in the correct place. To install the hinges in the door, I put the door in the opening and shimmed it so that the gap is equal on all sides, and then I transferred the line to the back edge of the door. I used the Craig hinge jig to drill a 35mm cups. This jig is awesome and it's perfect for installing Euro hinges. The center line lines right up with the jig, and then once it's clamped into place, I drill the holes. Using the double square, I make sure that the hinge is parallel to the edge of the door, and then I install the screws. While I sand the cabinets, I wanted to take a second to talk about today's sponsor, SimpleCove.com, my site. No, I'm not the sponsor. I just wanted to briefly talk to you, and if you're a woodworker, metal worker, or just make anything with your hands, sign up on the site and share your work. It's a great tool to create a free professional portfolio and to get your work out there. I also want to mention that we're always having contests with awesome prizes like the one that's going on right now. Click the link in the description or visit SimpleCove.com to sign up and start sharing your work. So to soften the edges of the shelves, I put a light roundover on the top and bottom edges using an 1/8 inch roundover bit. Since the doors are inset, they need some sort of stop to prevent them from hitting the shelves. I glued a wooden block on the back side of the face frame so that the doors will rest on it once they're closed. The back panels are an area that I wanted to add a little visual elements other than just a smooth painted MDF panel. I decided on a 1.5 inch beaded MDF panel that I picked up at the same time that I bought the plywood. To cut the panels, I set up a couple of roller stands to support it while ripping it to width, and then I used the track saw to cut them to length. The finishing process starts by spraying 2 coats of a latex primer, followed by 2 coats of a latex paint, and the color of the paint is 7074 Software in Satin by Sherwin Williams. And finally, to add a layer of protection, I sprayed 2 coats of a Satin Polycrylic. I sprayed both the poly and the paint using a 3-stage HVLP, and the gun had a 1.8mm tip. I didn't get a chance to record too much of the process because I didn't want to damage my camera. But overall, it took me a few days, and it wasn't too bad considering it was the first time that I had sprayed paint using an HVLP system. I did have to thin the primer and the paint using water, but it sprayed really well. The poly didn't require any thinning, so it was as simple as just pouring it and spraying it. With the finishing done, I can reassemble the case by first reinstalling the hinge adapter plate and then the hinges in the door. One thing I learned while doing this is to remember not only where each hinge went, but also the hinge adapter plate. It took me about an hour to get all that lined back up, but it came out great. And to install the back panel, I put it into place and then drew a line showing where the middle and the bottom shelves were, and then I shot a few brad nails in to keep it in place. Since I ordered the hinges without the soft close, I installed a Blue Motion soft close mechanism on top of one hinge on each door. And finally, the last piece of the puzzle is to install the door knobs. And to do this, I use a Craig jig, as it's a really super simple process to use the jig, and it makes it really fast and really accurate. I put the knobs about 2 inches down from the top edge of the door. And here they are completed. I love the minimal design and think that the color is perfect. And the hardware was a nice touch as well. I hope you enjoyed the build video. If you made it this far, let me know what you think in the comment below, and if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, hit the button and give the video a like as well. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next build video.